Black boy saves puppy from the river. Next day, a black SUV stops at his door. Under the warm spring sunlight in a modest Brooklyn neighborhood, 14-year-old James Wilson stood before his bedroom mirror, trying to smooth out the wrinkles in his worn t-shirt. His dark skin glowed in the morning light, and his naturally curly black hair, neatly trimmed, framed a face that carried wisdom beyond its years. His deep brown eyes, reflecting both determination and responsibility, told the story of a boy who had grown up too fast. The small apartment he shared with his mother and younger brother sat on the third floor of an aging building in their diverse community. Though space was tight, love and warmth filled every corner. His mother, a strong-willed 40-year-old woman, had been raising her two boys alone since their father's tragic workplace accident 3 years ago. She worked 2 jobs, morning shifts as an office cleaner downtown and evenings at a local restaurant. In their cramped living room, 8-year-old Marcus sat watching cartoons, occasionally coughing softly. His round face and gap-toothed smile were James's biggest motivation to keep pushing forward, despite their circumstances. The walls of their home might be thin, but they were thick with family photos and cherished memories. Life had grown more challenging since Marcus was diagnosed with severe asthma last year. Medical bills piled up, stretching their already thin finances to the breaking point. That's when James made the decision to help, taking a part-time job at Mr. Park's convenience store, a small but busy shop 3 blocks from their apartment. "James, don't forget to pick up Marcus's inhaler from the pharmacy," his mother called from the tiny kitchen, where the smell of toast and eggs filled the air. The medication cost nearly a week's worth of James's earnings, but he never complained. Each shift at the store meant another month of breathing easier for Marcus. After school and on weekends, James would stack shelves, help customers, and keep inventory at Mr. Park's store. The elderly Korean shopkeeper had taken a liking to James, impressed by the teenager's work ethic and quiet determination. "Young man like you," Mr. Park would say, "reminds me of myself when I first came to America." Between school assignments, work shifts, and caring for Marcus, James barely had time for himself. Yet he maintained his honor roll status, understanding that education was his ticket to a better future for his family. Despite his youth, James moved through life with the gravity of someone far older. Every morning he woke up an hour before sunrise to help Marcus with his breathing exercises, a routine their mother had taught them from the doctor's instructions. "In and out, buddy," he would say softly, sitting beside his brother's bed, "just like we practiced." The brothers shared a special bond that went beyond typical siblings. When their father passed away, James had silently stepped into the role of protector, not because anyone asked him to, but because he saw the worry lines deepening on his mother's face each day. He kept his own struggles quiet, like how he sometimes skipped lunch at school to save money for Marcus's medications, or how he stayed up late studying after his evening shifts at Mr. Park's store. His mother noticed, though. She would sometimes watch him from the doorway as he helped Marcus with homework, her heart swelling with pride and aching with wish that her son could just be a regular teenager. "You're so much like your father," she would say, her voice catching slightly. "He always put family first, too." James dreamed of college, of becoming a doctor who could help kids like Marcus. But for now, those dreams stayed tucked away behind more immediate concerns. Each day was a careful balance of responsibilities: morning medications, school, work, evening routines. Yet somehow he managed to maintain his place on the school's honor roll, understanding that education was his path to changing their future. On that fateful Saturday afternoon in late April, Riverside Park breathed with the vibrant energy of spring. Cherry blossoms dotted the winding pathways with delicate pink petals, while newly budded trees cast dappled shadows on the freshly mowed grass. The ornamental pond, centerpiece of the park, reflected the azure sky like a mirror, disturbed only by the occasional duck gliding across its surface. James cut through his usual path, checking his well-worn watch, a gift from his father on his last birthday. The weekend crowds had already filled the park, elderly couples on their afternoon walks, young parents pushing strollers, and children racing through the playground equipment. The sounds of their laughter mixed with the chirping of returning spring birds and the distant rumble of Brooklyn traffic. The sight of a young father teaching his son to ride a bike caught James's attention, stirring memories of his own father. 3 years had passed, but moments like these still brought a familiar ache to his chest. He adjusted his backpack, containing his work uniform from Mr. Park's store, and pressed on. Near the pond, a group of teenagers his age lounged on blankets, enjoying what looked like a picnic from the fancy bakery down the street. James felt the weight of the peanut butter sandwich in his backpack. Lunch would have to wait until his break. The money he might have spent on treats like those went straight to Marcus's medicine fund. The thought of his brother brought both warmth and worry. Marcus had been wheezing more than usual this morning, and the current prescription was running low. James mentally calculated his upcoming paycheck. 6 hours today, plus Sunday's shift. If he skipped lunch for a few days, they might manage the refill before next weekend. A cool breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolias, and James paused briefly at his favorite spot, a quiet bench overlooking the pond. Here, on better days, he sometimes stopped to work on his science homework. Ms. Thompson, his guidance counselor, had mentioned that Brooklyn Science High looked for students with perfect grades. It was a long shot, but dreams cost nothing to hold on to. The afternoon sun warmed his face as he checked his watch again. Still 10 minutes before his shift, enough time to walk the rest of the way without running. Mr. Park appreciated punctuality almost as much as he valued hard work. The serenity of the spring afternoon shattered with a piercing scream. "Help! Somebody, please, help!" The cry came from across the pond, where an elegantly dressed older woman was frantically pacing the water's edge, her silver-streaked hair coming loose from its sophisticated twist. "My puppy. Oh God, please. Someone help my puppy." Ms. Anderson's voice cracked with desperation as she pointed toward the water. Her designer handbag lay forgotten on the ground, contents spilling onto the grass. The blue leather leash, still clutched in her trembling hand, trailed uselessly beside her. From his position, James could see the small, brown and white dog thrashing in the water about 20 feet from shore. Puppy had apparently chased after a duck, breaking free from his owner's grip. Now the dog was trapped in a thick patch of water lilies and pondweeds, his struggles growing weaker with each passing moment. "I'll pay anything," Ms. Anderson called out to the gathering crowd, her composed upper-class demeanor crumbling into raw panic. "Please, he's all I have left. Since my husband—" Her voice broke again as she watched her beloved pet's head dip below the surface before bobbing up again. Several parkgoers had their phones out, some calling 911, others recording the scene. A jogger tried to comfort Ms. Anderson, who had sunk to her knees at the pond's edge, her expensive cream pants soaking up the damp earth. "The police are coming," someone assured her, but the look of helplessness on their faces suggested they knew help might arrive too late. "He's just a baby," Ms. Anderson sobbed, mascara trailing down her cheeks. "He's not even 2 years old. I've only had him 6 months since the shelter." She reached toward the water as if she could bridge the distance through sheer will. "Please, puppy, hold on." The small dog's eyes were wide with terror as he fought against the entangling plants. His usually pristine fur was matted to his small body, the blue collar with its silver name tag barely visible above the waterline. Each of his desperate barks seemed weaker than the last. A distinguished-looking gentleman in a business suit stepped forward and then back again, clearly wrestling with the desire to help and fear of the deep water. "Those water plants," he warned, "they can trap a swimmer. We should wait for rescue services." But Ms. Anderson wasn't listening. She had risen to her feet again, pacing and wringing her hands. "He's getting tired," she cried out, her voice thick with anguish. "Oh God, he's going to drown right in front of me." Her legs seemed to give out again, and 2 women rushed to support her as she swayed on her feet. The gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs of sympathy mixing with the sound of Puppy's increasingly feeble splashing. Time seemed to stretch like molasses, each second marked by Ms. Anderson's quiet sobs and the ripples of water around the struggling dog. The crowd around the pond had swelled to nearly 30 people, a diverse snapshot of Brooklyn life caught in a moment of collective tension. An elderly Jewish couple clutched each other's hands, whispering prayers in Hebrew. A group of Hispanic mothers pulled their children back from the water's edge, speaking rapid Spanish mixed with worried English. Some Asian college students had paused their weekend photography session, their cameras now focused on the unfolding drama. James observed it all from the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding against his ribs. The weight of his backpack, containing his work uniform and precious wages from last week, seemed to pin him in place. He thought of Mr. Park waiting at the store, of Marcus needing his medicine, of his mother's constant reminder. "We can't afford any risks, James." A young woman in yoga attire raised her phone higher, live streaming the scene. "Someone needs to do something," she called out, though her own feet remained firmly planted on safe ground. A muscular man in a gym tank top shifted uncomfortably, muttering about the water being too deep, the plants too dangerous. "The rescue services are still 8 minutes out," announced a middle-aged man in a business suit, phone pressed to his ear. 8 minutes. James watched Puppy's increasingly weak struggles, knowing the small dog wouldn't last that long. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Being brave isn't about not being scared, son. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified." James felt his hands trembling as he slipped his backpack off his shoulders. The memory of last summer's swimming lessons at the community center flooded his mind, the instructor's voice teaching them about water rescue, about approaching a drowning victim, about dealing with underwater plants. "Young man, don't even think about it," the business suit man warned, noticing James's movements. "Those plants are like underwater ropes. Wait for the professionals." But James wasn't listening anymore. He handed his backpack to a surprised elderly woman nearby, his phone and precious wages safely inside. "Please hold this," he said quietly, already unlacing his worn sneakers. His mind raced with calculations. Distance to Puppy, depth of the pond, strength of his swimming, time until his shift at Mr. Park's store. Ms. Anderson's quiet sobs pierced through his thoughts. In that moment, James realized some things mattered more than being on time for work, more than staying safe, more than all the careful plans they'd made to survive. The first shock of cold water stole James's breath as he waded in. April's warmth hadn't reached the pond's depths, and his thin t-shirt offered little protection. Each step was a careful calculation. The bottom was slick with mud and scattered with unseen obstacles. "Test each step," he remembered his swimming instructor saying. "Never rush into unknown waters." The crowd's voices faded into a distant hum as he focused on his breathing, just as he'd learned during those summer lessons. At waist depth, the real challenge began. The bottom dropped away suddenly, forcing him to start swimming. The water was murky, tinted green with algae, making it impossible to see what lay beneath the surface. James could hear his own heartbeat drumming in his ears as he struck out toward Puppy, whose struggles had weakened to occasional splashes. Halfway there, the first tendrils of underwater plants brushed against his legs. The sensation sent a spike of panic through his chest. They felt like cold, grasping fingers trying to pull him down. James forced himself to stay calm, remembering Marcus's face during asthma attacks. "Slow breaths," he would tell his brother. "Panic makes it worse." 20 feet had never seemed so far. Each stroke brought new challenges. The plants grew thicker, wrapping around his ankles with every kick. He had to pause repeatedly to untangle himself, precious seconds ticking by as Puppy's head dipped lower in the water. "Keep going, kid," someone shouted from shore. "You're almost there." The encouragement gave him strength, but the next moment, disaster struck. A particularly thick patch of water lilies caught his right leg, pulling him under mid-stroke. The murky water closed over his head, and for a terrifying moment, James felt the plants winding around his calf like rope. "Don't panic, don't panic, don't panic." He forced his eyes to open in the muddy water, reaching down to carefully untangle his leg. His lungs burned, but rushing would only make it worse. Finally breaking free, he surfaced with a gasping breath, hearing the crowd's collective sigh of relief. Puppy was only a few feet away now, but the small dog's situation was worse than it had appeared from shore. The plants had created a natural net, trapping the exhausted animal in their weave. James could see the blue collar tangled in the underwater growth, keeping Puppy's head barely above water. "Easy, buddy," James soothed, treading water carefully as he reached the dog. "I'm here to help." Puppy's eyes met his, filled with a desperate trust that made James's heart clench. The next few minutes were a delicate operation. James had to stay afloat while working to free the being, all while avoiding getting tangled himself. His fingers, numb from the cold water, fumbled with the twisted plants. Each time he freed one section, another seemed to tighten. His muscles screamed from the effort of staying afloat. The cold was seeping into his bones, making his movements slower, clumsier. Spots danced at the edges of his vision. He was running out of strength. "Almost there," he whispered, more to himself than to Puppy. With trembling fingers, he worked at the final knot of plants around the dog's collar. The world had narrowed to just this: cold water, tangled weeds, and a small life depending on him. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, the last plant gave way. Puppy was free, but the small dog was too exhausted to swim. James cradled him with one arm, using the other to start the journey back to shore. The return swim was even harder. His clothes felt like lead weights, and Puppy's scared shivering didn't help. Each stroke was a battle against exhaustion. The cold had seeped so deep that James could barely feel his limbs. The shore seemed to stretch further away with each passing moment. But he could hear Ms. Anderson's voice calling out encouragement, could feel Puppy's heart beating against his chest, and somehow, he kept going. Just when his strength was about to give out, his foot touched bottom. The crowd erupted in cheers as he staggered the last few steps toward shore, still clutching Puppy tightly to his chest. The moment James's feet touched solid ground, the world seemed to explode with sound and movement. His legs trembled violently beneath him, muscles screaming from the effort of the rescue. Several hands reached out from the crowd to steady him as he stumbled forward, still holding Puppy protectively against his chest. The small dog's heart is beating rapidly against his own, both of them shaking. James from exhaustion and cold, Puppy from fear and relief. "Puppy! Oh, my Puppy!" Ms. Anderson's cry cut through the general commotion. She rushed forward, her typically elegant appearance completely forgotten. Her silver-streaked hair had come loose from its sophisticated twist, mascara streaked down her cheeks, and her expensive cream-colored pants were soiled from kneeling at the pond's edge. None of that mattered as she reached for her beloved pet, tears flowing freely down her face. The small dog's tail gave a weak wag at his owner's voice, and he managed to lift his head slightly from James's chest. Despite his exhaustion, Puppy stretched toward Ms. Anderson, letting out a small whimper that seemed to say, "I'm okay, I made it." James carefully transferred the waterlogged pup into Ms. Anderson's waiting arms. The moment Puppy was secure in her embrace, his entire tiny body seemed to relax, as if finally believing he was truly safe. Ms. Anderson held him close, her tears falling into his wet fur as she whispered words of love and relief. The crowd that had gathered around them was a portrait of collective joy and relief. The elderly Jewish couple, who had been praying throughout the ordeal, were now smiling through tears, the husband saying, "Baruch Hashem Ripimbitena Hashem," repeatedly. The Hispanic mothers who had pulled their children back from the water were now moving closer, some crossing themselves and murmuring prayers of thanks. The Asian college students who had been photographing the scene had lowered their cameras, seeming to understand that some moments were too sacred to capture through a lens. Someone, the businessman who had earlier warned about the dangers, stepped forward and draped his expensive suit jacket over James's shoulders. "That was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen," he said, his previous caution transformed into open admiration. "Probably both." The elderly woman who had held James's backpack hurried forward to return it, her hands trembling with emotion as she patted his arm. "You're a hero, young man," she said softly, her voice thick with feeling. "A real hero." The word hero made James uncomfortable. He hadn't been trying to be heroic. He'd just known he couldn't stand by and watch Puppy drown. His father's words echoed in his memory. Real courage isn't about getting recognition. It's about doing what's right even when no one's watching. Ms. Anderson finally looked up from Puppy, her eyes meeting James's with an intensity that made him want to look away. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You risked your life for my Puppy. I'm Elizabeth Anderson, and I'll never forget what you've done. Never." Puppy, though still obviously exhausted, had begun to show signs of his usual spirit. He was covering Ms. Anderson's face with grateful licks, his tail wagging with increasing strength. His brown and white fur might be soaked and matted, but his eyes were bright with love and relief. A young girl, no more than 7, tugged at her mother's sleeve while pointing at James. "Mommy, he's like the heroes in my books," she exclaimed with childlike wonder. Her innocent observation brought smiles to the tired faces around them. "Young man," called out a woman who had been recording everything on her phone. "What's your name? People need to know about this." Several others in the crowd nodded in agreement, their phones still raised. Before James could respond, a voice from the back of the crowd called out, "His name is James Wilson. He works at Mr. Park's store." It was one of the regular customers from the convenience store, pride evident in her voice as she identified him. The mention of Mr. Park's store suddenly snapped James back to reality. He checked his waterlogged watch and felt his heart skip a beat. "Oh no," he gasped. "Work! I'm late for my shift." "Work?" Ms. Anderson looked startled. "But you're soaking wet, and you just saved." She clutched Puppy closer, seeming unable to complete the thought. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the atmosphere of celebration. The rescue services were finally arriving, too late for the rescue, but right on time to check on both James and Puppy. As a paramedic approached with a thermal blanket, James was already trying to figure out how to explain his tardiness to Mr. Park. "Please," Ms. Anderson caught his arm as he started to turn away. "You can't just leave. Let me do something to thank you properly." "What you did, it was extraordinary." Her eyes were still brimming with tears, but there was something else there now. Determination. James managed a tired smile, his teeth chattering slightly despite the borrowed jacket. "I'm really glad I could help, ma'am, but I need to get to work. Mr. Park is counting on me, and I can't afford to lose this job." He didn't add that his family couldn't afford it either. The crowd's reaction to his words was immediate and vocal. "He can't go to work like this. Someone should call his boss. He's a hero, for heaven's sake." The voices blended together in a chorus of concern and indignation. Ms. Anderson straightened up, still holding Puppy close, but with a new purpose in her bearing. "At least let me drive you to the store," she offered. "I need to explain to your employer why you're late. It's the very least I can do." As if sensing the importance of the moment, Puppy gave another appreciative lick to James's hand, his tail wagging with renewed energy. The small dog's resilience was remarkable, just like the boy who had saved him. James rushed down the bustling street, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at his wristwatch for the umpteenth time, only to confirm what he already knew. He was late for work. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as James weaved through the crowd, muttering apologies to those he bumped into in his haste. In James's mind, anxiety about being late grew with each passing second. He imagined the scowling face of his boss, a middle-aged man who highly valued punctuality and discipline. James recalled how harshly his boss had reacted when colleagues were late before. He wondered if he'd face severe reprimand or worse, lose his job. The more he thought, the more worried James became. He tried to conjure up plausible reasons for his tardiness. A faulty alarm clock, unexpected traffic, a family emergency. James sifted through scenarios in his head, trying to choose one that sounded convincing, without seeming like a cheap excuse. When James finally reached the shop door, he paused briefly to catch his breath and attempt to calm his racing heart. He smoothed down his disheveled hair, trying to look less frazzled after his half-marathon across town. With a deep breath to summon courage, James pushed open the door and stepped inside. Immediately, his boss's eyes locked onto him. James swallowed hard, feeling his throat go dry as the boss approached, his expression unreadable. "James," the boss spoke, his voice low and stern. "Do you know what time it is?" James hung his head, feeling like a child caught in wrongdoing. "I'm sorry, sir," he stammered. "I can explain." But before James could offer a reason, his boss cut him off. "I don't need excuses, James. This is the 3rd time this month. You know we have many customers in the morning, and being short-staffed can affect the whole day's revenue." James felt his face burn with shame. He knew his boss was right, and that only made him feel worse. "I'll make it up," James said, hoping to salvage the situation. I can stay later today to help out more. The boss stared at James for a moment, as if weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. All right, James, I appreciate your willingness, but this is the last time. Understand? Next time, I'll have to reconsider your position here. James nodded quickly, relieved not to be fired on the spot, but understanding he was on thin ice. He hurried to his workstation, determined to work twice as hard to make up for his tardiness. As the day progressed, James couldn't stop thinking about the morning's incident. He promised himself he'd improve his habits, set multiple alarms, and prepare everything the night before. James understood that this job was important to him, and he couldn't let small mistakes like this jeopardize his career prospects. When his shift ended, James felt exhausted but satisfied. He had worked diligently all day, trying to compensate for his late arrival. As he prepared to leave, his boss called him over. "James," he said, his tone softer than in the morning, "I appreciate your effort today. Keep it up." James nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. He knew he'd been given another chance, and he was determined not to let his boss down. As he walked out of the shop, James told himself that tomorrow he'd be the first to arrive and open the store. The experience had been a wake-up call for James. He realized how close he'd come to losing a job he actually cared about. On his way home, he mentally listed the changes he needed to make: going to bed earlier, preparing his clothes and lunch the night before, and setting multiple alarms. He even considered asking a friend to call him in the morning as an extra precaution. As James reached his apartment, he felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The day had been stressful, but it had also reinforced the importance of his job and the need for personal responsibility. He knew that tomorrow would be a fresh start, an opportunity to prove to his boss and to himself that he could be reliable and hardworking. Before going to bed that night, James triple-checked his alarm settings and laid out everything he'd need for the morning. As he drifted off to sleep, his last thoughts were of arriving early at the shop, greeting his boss with a smile, and starting the day off right. Tomorrow, he promised himself, would be different. That evening, after ensuring Lucky was safely tucked in at home, Ms. Anderson found herself drawn back to the neighborhood. Her thoughts kept returning to the young hero who had rushed away so quickly, worried about being late for work. The modest convenience store city was still lit when she arrived, its windows casting a warm glow onto the darkening street. A small bell chimed as she pushed open the door. Behind the counter, an elderly Korean man was carefully arranging items on the shelves. He turned at the sound, offering a gentle smile. "Welcome, though I should mention we're closing in 20 minutes. Actually," Ms. Anderson stepped forward, "I'm looking for James. He helped me today at the park, saved my dog from drowning. He mentioned working here, but had to rush off before I could properly thank him." Mr. Park's eyes softened with recognition. "Ah, so that explains why he arrived soaking wet." He apologized repeatedly for being late, but wouldn't explain until I pressed him. He shook his head fondly. "That's James, always thinking of others before himself. But he's already gone home. He leaves at 4 to help his little brother Marcus with homework." Would you mind telling me about him?" Ms. Anderson asked, something in Mr. Park's tone suggesting there was more to the story. The elderly shopkeeper gestured to a chair near the counter. "Please sit. I was about to have some tea." As he prepared 2 cups, he began sharing what he knew. James started working here shortly after his father passed away in an accident. He was just 12 then, but his eyes— Mr. Park paused, lost in memory. They had the same look my son had when we first came to America, too grown up for his years. The tea was warm and fragrant as Mr. Park continued. "He works every day after school, never complains. Does his homework during quiet moments. I insisted on that. Sometimes I see him fighting sleep over his textbooks, but he never gives up. His mother, Sarah, works 2 jobs, cleaning offices downtown in the mornings and a restaurant in the evenings. James brings his entire paycheck home to her. When I suggested he keep some for himself, he just smiled and said his father taught him family comes first." Mr. Park's voice grew softer. "The little one, Marcus, has severe asthma. James spends most of his earnings on his brother's medications. Sometimes he skips lunch to save extra money for them. I try to send him home with slightly damaged produce when I can, things I couldn't sell anyway, but he always insists on paying something." Ms. Anderson felt her heart tighten as the picture became clearer. Does he ever talk about his dreams? She asked quietly. Once, when he was particularly tired, he mentioned wanting to become a doctor. Mr. Park smiled sadly. He wants to help children like his brother, but dreams like that need resources his family doesn't have right now. Still, he never shows bitterness, just keeps working, studying, doing his best. As Miss Anderson listened, she felt tears threatening to well up. The boy who had risked his life to save Lucky wasn't just brave. He was extraordinary in ways she hadn't even known. She thought of her own comfortable life, of the empty rooms in her large house, of the educational trust fund her late husband had left, meant to help promising young people. You know, Mr. Park added thoughtfully, in my culture, we believe that adversity reveals character. James, he's had more than his share of hardship, but it's only made his light shine brighter. Still, he hesitated. Sometimes I worry that he's had to grow up too fast. A boy his age should have time to just be young. Rising to leave, Ms. Anderson felt a deep resolve settling in her heart. She had come seeking to offer thanks, but she had found something far more meaningful. A story of quiet courage and dignity that demanded more than mere gratitude. As she drove home through the darkening evening, her mind was already forming plans, ways to help that would honor James's pride and determination while opening doors to the future he deserved. The following afternoon, a gleaming black Mercedes SUV wound its way through the narrow streets of the Brooklyn neighborhood, its polished surface reflecting the autumn sunlight like a mirror. The vehicle seemed almost out of place among the worn apartment buildings and modest family cars, drawing curious glances from children playing on the sidewalks and elderly residents sitting on their front stoops. As the Mercedes carefully navigated past overflowing garbage bins and double-parked delivery trucks, its quiet engine barely hummed, a stark contrast to the usual rattling exhaust that echoed through these streets. The car moved with deliberate grace, like a swan gliding through a pond of dust, until it came to a stop directly in front of the Wilson's-Hagen apartment building. Inside their third-floor apartment, James sat at the kitchen table helping Marcus with his math homework. Their mother, Sarah, who had just returned from her morning shift cleaning offices, was the first to notice the unusual sight from their window. "James," she called softly, her eyes fixed on the scene below. "There's someone coming to our building." Her voice held a mix of curiosity and concern as she watched the luxury vehicle carefully parallel park in a space that rarely saw anything fancier than decade-old sedans. Marcus immediately abandoned his multiplication tables and pressed his face against the window glass, his breath fogging up the pane. "Wow, look at that car," he exclaimed, brown eyes wide with wonder. "It's like the ones in those car magazines at Dr. Thompson's office." His previous wheezing seemed forgotten in his excitement. James felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized the elegant figure stepping out of the driver's seat. Ms. Anderson looked different from yesterday, more casual in a simple sweater and slacks, but still carrying an air of refinement that matched her vehicle. His surprise doubled when he saw Lucky bouncing out after her, the golden retriever's coat gleaming almost as brightly as the car's paint. "James?" His mother's voice now held a note of concern, her eyes moving between her son and the scene below. "Is there something you need to tell me?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly aware that he hadn't mentioned yesterday's incident to his family. "I helped her dog at the park yesterday," he began hesitantly. "It fell into the pond and I had to swim out to get it." He tried to make it sound casual, but his mother's expression showed she knew there was more to the story. "You went into the water?" Sarah's voice mixed worry with disbelief. "In this weather? James Wilson, why didn't you tell me about this?" Marcus turned from the window, momentarily forgetting about the fancy car as he stared at his brother with newfound awe. "You saved a dog? Like a real superhero?" The pride in his voice made James's cheeks warm. The sound of the building's front door opening echoed up through their thin walls, followed by the click of heels on the worn stairs. James could hear Lucky's excited panting and the gentle jingling of his collar growing closer. The entire family seemed to freeze in place, listening to the approaching footsteps. Sarah quickly smoothed her work uniform and glanced around their modest living room, where the worn but clean furniture told the story of their careful housekeeping despite limited means. James noticed how she straightened her shoulders, the same way she did when meeting with Marcus's doctors, putting on a brave face despite her uncertainty. Through their thin walls, they could hear each step on the creaking stairs, the sound growing louder as Ms. Anderson and Lucky made their way to the third floor. Marcus clutched James's sleeve with nervous excitement, while their mother took a deep breath and moved toward the door, her expression a complex mixture of curiosity, pride, and protective concern. James stood up slowly, his own heart racing. He hadn't expected Ms. Anderson to come here, hadn't planned on his two worlds colliding like this. But watching his mother's protective stance and feeling Marcus's excited grip on his sleeve, he realized that maybe this unexpected visit was about to change more than just his afternoon plans. A gentle knock echoed through the apartment, and Sarah opened the door to find Mrs. Anderson standing there with Lucky sitting obediently at her feet. Next to her stood a young girl around Marcus's age, her blonde hair neatly braided and her blue eyes bright with curiosity. "Mrs. Wilson?" Ms. Anderson's warm smile seemed to fill the doorway. "I'm Elizabeth Anderson, and this is my daughter, Emma. Your son, James, did something extraordinary yesterday, and we hope we might have a moment to properly thank him." Sarah's initial nervousness softened at the genuine warmth in Ms. Anderson's voice. "Please come in." She stepped back, gesturing welcomingly. "And your four-legged friend, too, of course." As they entered the modest living room, Marcus could barely contain his excitement. "Is that the dog James saved?" he burst out, then remembered his manners and added shyly, "I'm Marcus." Emma's face lit up at finding someone her age. "Yes, this is Lucky," she said, kneeling beside the golden retriever. "Want to pet him? He's really friendly." Marcus looked questioningly at his mother, who nodded her permission. As he approached carefully, Lucky's tail began wagging enthusiastically. The dog gently nuzzled Marcus's hand, drawing a delighted giggle from the boy. "He remembers you," Ms. Anderson said softly to James, watching as Lucky kept glancing back at him, even while accepting Marcus's attention. "Dogs never forget the people who help them." Sarah invited everyone to sit, and Ms. Anderson began recounting the events at the park. As she described James's brave swim through the cold water, Sarah's eyes filled with tears of pride and concern. Marcus listened with rapt attention, occasionally glancing at his brother with undisguised admiration. "I was so scared," Emma added, her voice small as she remembered. "But James didn't hesitate. He just jumped in like a real hero from my books." James felt his cheeks warming at the praise. "Anyone would have done the same," he mumbled. But Ms. Anderson shook her head. "No, James, many people were there, but only you acted. That kind of courage is special." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small package. "Lucky wanted to bring you something to say thank you." Inside the package was a framed photograph of Lucky, looking healthy and happy, taken just that morning. At the bottom was an inscription, "To my hero, love, Lucky." Marcus scooted closer to see the photo while Emma began telling him stories about Lucky's adventures. The two children quickly bonded, sharing laughs as Lucky moved between them, soaking up the attention. Sarah watched it all with gentle amazement, her usually serious Marcus laughing freely, James slowly relaxing as he realized his actions were truly appreciated, and their modest apartment filled with unexpected warmth and joy. "You have remarkable children, Mrs. Wilson," Ms. Anderson said quietly, watching Emma and Marcus playing with Lucky. "James's bravery yesterday, it wasn't just physical courage, it was the kind that comes from a good heart." Sarah smiled softly, watching James now joining in with the younger children's play, finally acting like the teenager he was. "They've had to be strong," she replied, "especially since their father." Her voice trailed off. Ms. Anderson reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand gently. The gesture spoke volumes, understanding, respect, and a promise of friendship that transcended their different circumstances. As Lucky entertained the children with tricks Emma had taught him, the adults shared coffee and began talking more freely. The initial awkwardness melted away, replaced by genuine connection and shared smiles at the children's laughter. What had started as a thank you visit was transforming into something more meaningful, the beginning of a bond between two families brought together by one boy's courageous act. After the children had settled into playing with Lucky, Ms. Anderson turned to Sarah and James with a more serious expression. "There's something else I'd like to discuss with you both," she said, reaching for her handbag. "Something that my late husband and I established years ago." Sarah straightened in her chair, instinctively sensing the importance of the moment. James, too, moved closer to his mother, his expression attentive. "My husband Robert was a firm believer in education," Ms. Anderson began, her voice soft with memory. "Before he passed away, we created the Anderson Educational Foundation, specifically to help promising young students who demonstrate exceptional character and determination." She pulled out a folder embossed with a simple gold logo. "The foundation offers full scholarships through high school and college, including all educational expenses, books, supplies, and even a stipend for living expenses." She paused, looking directly at James, "And we've been looking for the right candidate, and yesterday I saw everything we've been searching for." James's eyes widened as he processed her words. Sarah reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "The scholarship would cover your remaining years at Brooklyn Science High. Yes, I heard about your interest from Mr. Park." Ms. Anderson smiled at James's surprise. "It would continue through any college you choose, including medical school if that remains your dream." Marcus, who had been playing with Lucky nearby, stopped to listen, his young face serious as he sensed the gravity of the moment. "Additionally," Ms. Anderson continued, turning to Sarah, "the foundation works with several corporate partners. One of them is Metropolitan Hospital Network, where I serve on the board. They're currently looking for an administrative coordinator in their pediatric department. The position offers full benefits, including comprehensive health insurance for the whole family." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Health insurance?" she whispered, her mind immediately going to Marcus's medical needs. "The position would replace both your current jobs, with better hours and significantly higher pay," Ms. Anderson explained gently. "And yes, the insurance would cover all of Marcus's medications and treatments." James sat very still, his mind racing. No more worrying about Marcus's prescriptions, no more watching his mother exhaust herself, working 2 jobs. No more impossible choices between books and medicine. "This isn't charity," Ms. Anderson added, noting the pride in James's expression. "The scholarship is earned through merit and character, both of which you have demonstrated abundantly. And Sarah, the position needs someone organized, hardworking, and experienced in multitasking. Exactly the skills you've shown managing 2 jobs while raising 2 remarkable boys." She opened the folder, revealing several documents. "Everything is here in writing. The scholarship details, job description, benefits package. Take your time to review it all. Have a lawyer look it over if you'd like. We want you to feel completely comfortable with everything." Emma, who had been quietly petting Lucky, spoke up. "Does this mean James could come to my school? Brooklyn Science is where I go too." The adults smiled at her enthusiasm, breaking some of the emotional tension in the room. I don't know what to say," Sarah finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Say you'll consider it," Ms. Anderson replied warmly. "The foundation's purpose is to invest in promising futures, and James's actions yesterday showed us exactly the kind of person we want to support. Someone who acts with courage, thinks of others before himself, and never gives up, no matter the circumstances." Marcus tugged at his brother's sleeve. "Does this mean no more scary breathing at night?" he asked innocently, referring to his asthma attacks. James pulled his little brother close, his own eyes misting. "Yeah, buddy, no more scary breathing." Sarah looked at her sons, then back at Ms. Anderson. "How can we ever thank you for this opportunity?" "James already did," Ms. Anderson smiled, watching Lucky contentedly curled up between the children. "We're just paying it forward. Sometimes a single act of courage can open doors we never even knew existed." The afternoon light streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the scene. 2 families from different worlds, brought together by one brave act, now forging a connection that would change all their lives forever. In the days that followed, news of James's act of bravery and Ms. Anderson's response spread through the neighborhood like a gentle ripple in a pond. The story seemed to touch something deep in the community's heart, reminding everyone that extraordinary moments could happen in the most ordinary places. Mr. Park's convenience store became an unexpected hub for sharing the tale. Regular customers who had known James as the quiet, hardworking boy behind the counter now saw him in a new light. They shared proud smiles when he worked his shifts, and many made a point to tell new customers, "That's James, the boy who jumped into the pond to save a dog." "You know," Mr. Park would tell anyone who'd listen, his eyes twinkling, "I always knew that boy was special. When everyone else was just watching and recording with their phones, he acted. That's real character." The story reached Brooklyn Science High School, where James would soon be attending. Teachers who heard about their future student shared knowing looks. This was exactly the kind of student they loved to teach. Current students, including Emma Anderson's friends, eagerly anticipated welcoming him. The local community center, where James had learned to swim the previous summer, put up a small display about water safety and courage, featuring the story without naming names, though everyone knew who it was about. The swimming instructor who had taught James remembered him as the student who had asked the most questions about water rescue techniques. Even the elderly residents who spent their days on the front stoops had something new to discuss. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had lived in the building for 40 years, would tell anyone who passed by, "I've watched that boy grow up, always helping his mama, always looking after his little brother. Now the whole world gets to see what we've always known." The neighborhood children, especially Marcus's friends, started looking at James differently. He was no longer just another teenager, but someone who proved that heroes didn't need capes or superpowers. Sometimes they just needed courage and a good heart. At the local diner where Sarah had worked evenings, her former co-workers celebrated her new job opportunity. "Couldn't have happened to a better person," the cook declared, wrapping up an extra slice of pie for her to take home. "Some people just deserve a break, you know?" The change was most visible in how people interacted with each other. Neighbors who had barely nodded in passing now stopped to chat. The community seemed to stand a little straighter, smile a little more readily, as if James's action had reminded them of their own capacity for kindness. Ms. Anderson and Lucky became regular visitors to the neighborhood. Sometimes they would bring Emma for playdates with Marcus, and the sight of the elegant SUV parked outside the old apartment building no longer drew surprised stares. Instead, it became a symbol of how bridges could be built between different worlds. The most touching responses came from unexpected places. The elderly Jewish couple who had prayed during the rescue sent over a homemade challah bread. The Hispanic mothers organized a small celebration at the community center. The Asian college students who had photographed the rescue created a beautiful portrait of James with Lucky, which they gave to both families. But perhaps the most profound change was in how the community viewed itself. As one longtime resident put it, "Sometimes we forget that heroes don't just exist in other places or on TV. Sometimes they're growing up right next door, carrying their little brother's inhaler and working at the corner store." The story became part of the neighborhood's fabric, not just as a tale of rescue and reward, but as a reminder that extraordinary moments could spring from ordinary lives, and that sometimes the most important acts of courage were the quiet ones that happened every day, like a boy taking on adult responsibilities to help his family, or a mother working 2 jobs to keep her children's dreams alive. In the end, the community's response wasn't just about celebrating a single brave act or its fortunate outcome. It was about recognizing the quiet dignity and strength that had always existed in their midst, waiting for the right moment to shine. 3 months after that fateful afternoon, the Wilson family's life had transformed in ways they could hardly have imagined. Sarah, no longer wearing the tired factory uniform, left for work each morning in professional attire, her braided hair neat and her smile bright as she headed to her new position at Anderson Properties. The pride in her walk was unmistakable. This was more than just a job. It was a career that respected her skills and experience. James, freed from his after-school responsibilities at Mr. Park's store, had thrown himself into his studies with renewed energy. His natural intelligence, no longer constrained by exhaustion and limited time, flourished. He joined the science club he had always dreamed about and quickly became one of its most active members. His teachers, who had always seen his potential, marveled at how he seemed to have come alive with new possibilities. The most visible change was in their home life. With Sarah's better income and regular hours, family dinners became a nightly ritual rather than a rare luxury. The apartment, though still modest, now had new books on the shelves, a proper desk for James's studies, and even a small fish tank that Tommy loved to watch. A birthday gift from Ms. Anderson that also served as James's first experience in animal care. Tommy thrived in the new atmosphere, his natural cheerfulness amplified by the reduced stress in their home. His grades improved too, partly because James now had more time to help him with homework, but mostly because he had seen firsthand that dreams could come true with hard work and determination. The family still lived in the same apartment building, maintaining their connections to the community that had supported them through difficult times. But now, instead of being symbols of perseverance in hardship, they had become beacons of hope. Sarah still brought homemade meals to Mrs. Martinez when her arthritis acted up, and James continued to help younger kids with their studies, not out of obligation, but from a genuine desire to give back. Perhaps the most profound change wasn't in their circumstances, but in their outlook. The weight of constant worry had lifted from Sarah's shoulders, allowing her natural warmth to shine through more often. James, while still mature for his age, had rediscovered some of the joy of being a teenager. And Tommy, watching his family transform, was learning invaluable lessons about resilience, opportunity, and the importance of maintaining dignity through life's challenges. Every Saturday afternoon, James would walk to the Andersons' home to spend time with Lucky. What started as casual visits had evolved into a beautiful weekly tradition. The moment James appeared at the front gate, Lucky would bound across the manicured lawn, tail wagging wildly, his elderly frame somehow finding renewed energy at the sight of his young rescuer. Mrs. Anderson often watched from her window as James and Lucky spent hours together in the backyard. The 14-year-old would bring his veterinary science books, reading aloud to Lucky, who would lie contentedly at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to nuzzle James's hand as if encouraging him to continue. These study sessions had a special quality. James was not just learning about animal care, he was practicing it with a patient who had become his dearest friend. Their bond went beyond ordinary human-animal companionship. Lucky seemed to understand James in a unique way. On days when James felt overwhelmed by his new academic challenges, Lucky would sense his mood and simply rest his head on the boy's lap, offering silent comfort. During their walks around the neighborhood, Lucky would match his pace to James's, the two moving in perfect synchronization, as if they'd been together for years rather than months. Tommy would sometimes join their Saturday sessions, and Lucky would orchestrate a perfect balance between both brothers, playing energetically with the younger boy while maintaining his special connection with James. The sight of the two brothers and the golden retriever playing in the Andersons' backyard became a regular fixture in the neighborhood, a living reminder of how one brave act had changed so many lives. James took his role in Lucky's life seriously. He learned about senior dog care, discussing diet and exercise recommendations with Lucky's veterinarian during checkups. Ms. Anderson had even begun consulting James about Lucky's daily routine, trusting his growing knowledge and natural intuition with her beloved pet. Perhaps the most touching aspect of their friendship was how it transcended their different worlds. Lucky, a pampered family pet from an affluent household, and James, a boy who had known hardship and responsibility beyond his years, shared a connection that ignored all social boundaries. Their friendship was pure and simple, built on trust, gratitude, and genuine affection. Amanda often joked that Lucky had two families now, the Andersons and the Wilsons. And in many ways, he had become a bridge between their worlds, his unconditional love helping to ease any lingering awkwardness between the families' different circumstances. Through Lucky, both families had learned that the truest connections come from the heart, unbound by social status or background. The story of James Wilson and Lucky became more than just a tale of a rescue. It evolved into a powerful lesson about how single acts of kindness can create ripples of positive change. In the years that followed, whenever someone would praise James for jumping into the cold river that day, he would simply smile and say that he had done what anyone would do. But those who knew the full story understood that it wasn't just about that one moment of bravery. The true beauty lay in how James had lived his life before that fateful day, working diligently at Mr. Park's store, helping neighbors with their groceries, tutoring younger children, all while maintaining his grades and caring for his family. The rescue of Lucky hadn't created his character. It had merely revealed it to a wider audience. Ms. Anderson often reflected that what had moved her most wasn't just James's courage in saving Lucky, but the quiet dignity with which he had rushed off to work afterward, expecting nothing in return. The opportunity Mrs. Anderson provided wasn't merely a reward for a single heroic act. Rather, it was recognition of the daily heroism James had shown throughout his young life. The kind of heroism that came in small, consistent acts of responsibility and kindness. Through her actions, she demonstrated that sometimes the greatest kindness is not in giving charity, but in providing opportunities that allow others to realize their full potential. Sarah Wilson's story became an inspiration at Anderson Properties, where she quickly earned respect for her work ethic and attention to detail. Her success proved that sometimes people only need a chance to demonstrate their capabilities. The dignity with which the Wilson family had faced their challenges, and the grace with which they accepted help when it came, taught valuable lessons about both giving and receiving. Tommy grew up understanding that good things don't always come instantly or easily, but they do come to those who maintain their integrity and work hard. The sight of his brother studying to become a veterinarian while still making time to help others showed him that success doesn't mean forgetting where you came from or who helped you along the way. Perhaps the most profound message was how true kindness creates connections that transcend social boundaries. The friendship between the Wilson and Anderson families proved that authentic relationships could bridge any gap when built on mutual respect and genuine care for one another. Lucky, in his own way, demonstrated that love and loyalty know no social class. The neighborhood learned that hope isn't just about waiting for good things to happen. It's about recognizing and nurturing the good that already exists in our communities. Every time James visited Lucky, every time Sarah excelled at her new job, every time Tommy shared his family's story with pride, they reinforced the message that kindness, however small it might seem, has the power to transform lives in unexpected ways.